The sirens began before the sun went down. They always did. A long, rising wail that slid through the streets like a warning from something ancient and hungry. People said you got used to it. They lied. No matter how many nights passed, the sound still reached inside my chest and twisted something tight. I was sweeping the tunnel floor when it started, pushing dust and grit into a corner that would be filthy again by morning. The broom paused in my hands. Above us, London was still pretending to be alive. I worked underground, far below the shops and houses and churches. The tunnels were never meant for living, only passing through. But now they were our shelter, our lungs, our last skin between flesh and fire. My job had always been simple before the war. Clean the platforms, empty bins, wipe benches, invisible work for invisible men. But when the bombs came, the tunnels changed. They filled with bodies, with breath, with fear. And I stayed, because someone had to keep the floor clear when people collapsed. Because someone had to mop the blood when the ceiling shook too hard. By the time the sirens ended, the first explosions had already begun. You felt them before you heard them. A deep, rolling pressure that pushed down to the earth, through bone, through thought. Dust drifted from the ceiling like gray snow. A woman screamed somewhere to my left. A child started crying, the thin, animal sound of pure terror. I leaned my broom against the wall and braced myself, counting the seconds between blasts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Too close. People poured down the stairwells in waves, shoes slipping, coats half-buttoned, faces pale and shining with sweat. They carried bundles, babies, bags stuffed with papers and photographs. Everything they thought mattered, everything they were afraid to lose. I watched them pass, pressed against the wall, my back cold against damp stone. No one looked at me. They never did. I was just part of the tunnel, another shadow that belonged underground. The lights flickered, then steadied. The smell came next, smoke, oil, something sharp and chemical that stung the nose. Above us, buildings were opening like wounds. Down here, we waited. Waiting was the hardest part. Not knowing which explosion would be the one that cracked the earth open. Not knowing whose house was gone. Not knowing if the stairway you just walked down would still exist when morning came. I moved through the crowd slowly, checking corners, clearing debris where the plaster had fallen. People sat on the floor now, backs against the walls, knees drawn up. Some prayed, some stared, some rocked back and forth, whispering the same words again and again like repetition could build a shield. I recognized faces. A butcher from the high street, a school teacher, an old man who used to feed pigeons in the square. Here, titles meant nothing. We were all just bodies hiding from the sky. Another blast. Closer this time. The tunnel groaned like an animal in pain. Someone shouted. Someone dropped a suitcase, spilling clothes and tin cups across the ground. I knelt automatically, gathering the pieces, hands moving without thought. This was how I survived, by staying busy. If I stopped, if I let myself imagine what was happening above us, I would break. A boy tugged at my sleeve. He couldn't have been more than 6. His face was streaked with dirt, his eyes too large in his skull. "Is it safe?" he asked. His voice was barely louder than the bombs. I looked at him and felt something crack open inside me. I wanted to tell him yes. I wanted to lie. Instead, I said nothing. I just nodded once, slow and careful, and he seemed to accept that. Children learned quickly during the Blitz, faster than they should have. Hours passed like this. The bombs fell in patterns, waves of thunder that rolled and never quite stopped. The tunnels grew warmer, heavier. Breath piled on breath, sweat soaked into coats. The floor became slick with mud tracked in from the streets above. I fetched buckets of water, cleaned where I could, guided people away from damaged sections. Somewhere deep in the night, the first body arrived. He was carried down by 2 wardens, his head lolling back, his face gray. Shrapnel, they said, caught him outside before he reached shelter. They laid him against the wall, gently, like he might wake. Someone covered his face with a scarf. No one spoke. Death underground felt different, quieter, like the tunnels were swallowing it whole. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the stillness of him. I wondered who he was before this night, what he'd been doing when the sirens started. whether he'd hesitated, thinking he had time. The thought followed me as I returned to my work, sweeping around his feet, careful not to touch him. The routine mattered. If I treated death like something special, something sacred, I wouldn't survive the night. Sometime after midnight, the crying slowed. Exhaustion pressed down on everyone like another layer of earth. People slept sitting up, heads on shoulders, mouths open. Others stayed awake, eyes fixed on nothing, listening for changes in the rhythm of destruction. I leaned against a pillar and closed my eyes for just a moment. The ground shook again and I was awake instantly, heart pounding, palms slick. The bombs did not stop. They never did. They only moved, from one neighborhood to another, from one street to the next. London burned above us, and we lay beneath it like the roots of a dying tree, holding on because there was nowhere else to go. I checked my watch. Nearly dawn. That meant nothing anymore. Daylight did not bring safety. It only revealed the damage. I thought of my own room, a narrow place near the river. I thought of the kettle on my stove. I wondered if either still existed. The thought came without emotion. Loss had become theoretical. When the all clear finally sounded, it was almost unfamiliar. A different tone, lower, final. People stirred, confused, as if waking from a shared nightmare. Some laughed softly. Some cried. Some didn't move at all. I leaned my broom against the wall again and waited. Above us, the city was still burning. Below, the tunnels exhaled their living cargo back toward the light. I stayed behind, as I always did. Someone had to clean. Someone had to erase the night enough that people could come back again tomorrow. I swept ash from the floor. I wiped benches. I stepped around the dark stains that would never fully come out. And as I worked, I realized something that scared me more than the bombs. This wasn't one night. This was my life now. The sirens did not fade this time. They rose, fell, then rose again, like something breathing above the city. Something patient and cruel. I stood in the underground tunnel with my broom resting against my leg, listening to the sound echo through concrete and steel. The first bombs had already fallen hours ago, shaking dust from the ceiling like dry snow. We all expected silence by now. We were wrong. The night was only beginning, and it would not let go. People crowded deeper into the tunnels as the explosions crept closer. Families pressed against walls, coats wrapped tight, eyes wide and hollow. Children clutched blankets, dolls, anything soft that still belonged to the world before the bombs. Every time the ground trembled, someone cried out, not loudly, just enough to remind the rest of us that fear was still alive. I swept broken glass and plaster from the floor, not because it mattered, but because moving kept my hands from shaking. The air grew thick as more people arrived. Smoke drifted down through the stairwells, mixing with sweat, oil, and fear. Somewhere above us, a street had vanished. You could hear it in the way the bombs landed closer now, heavier, like fists pounding the city into submission. The lights flickered. When they steadied, faces looked different, older, carved by shadow. I wondered how many of us would see daylight again. A woman sat against the wall near the tracks, rocking back and forth, whispering names I didn't recognize. A man beside her stared straight ahead, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. No one spoke to them. There was nothing to say. Words felt small under all that noise. I kept sweeping, passing the same stretch of tunnel again and again, like if I cleaned it enough, the night might decide we had suffered enough. Then came the pause. A terrible, unnatural quiet, the kind that makes your heart beat louder than the world. People looked at each other, hope flickering for just a second. Maybe it was over. Maybe this was the end of it. I had learned better. I tightened my grip on the broom just as the next wave hit, louder than before. A deep rolling thunder that seemed to crack the city open. Dust poured from the ceiling. Someone screamed. The lights went out completely this time, plunging us into darkness broken only by emergency lamps and the faint glow of cigarettes. In that darkness, fear multiplied. Breathing grew fast and uneven. Children cried openly now. I could feel the tunnel itself trembling, like it might collapse and bury us where we stood. I pressed my palm against the wall, cold and damp, grounding myself in something solid. Minutes stretched into hours. Or maybe it was the other way around. Time lost its meaning down there. The bombs kept coming, and with each one, something inside me broke a little more. I thought of my wife asleep in another shelter across the city. I thought of the flat we used to have, the window that faced the street, the kettle always left on too long. I didn't know if any of it still existed. I didn't know if she did. People began to lie down where they sat, exhaustion overtaking fear. Some slept, some pretended to, others just stared into nothing, eyes open, waiting. I continued my rounds, stepping carefully over bodies curled on the floor. The tunnel felt less like shelter now and more like a waiting room for the end. Above us, London burned. Below, we endured. Near dawn, or what I guessed was dawn, the bombing slowed. Not stopped, just spaced out, as if the sky itself was tired. The silence between explosions grew longer, heavier. No one cheered. No one moved. We had learned not to trust quiet. I leaned against my broom, shoulders aching, ears ringing, and realized something with a cold certainty. This night would stay with us forever. Even when it ended, it would not end. Because the bombs were not the worst part. It was the waiting, the listening, the knowing that somewhere above, the city was being erased piece by piece while we stood underground, counting breaths, hoping the ceiling would hold. And when the sirens finally fell silent, no one believed them. Morning did not arrive the way it used to. There was no gentle light, no birds, no sense of renewal. It came slowly, reluctantly, like the city itself was unsure whether it deserved another day. Somewhere above the tunnels, the bombing had finally stopped. Not because mercy arrived, but because the planes had run out of targets, or fuel, or patience. The silence that followed was heavier than the explosions. It pressed down on my ears until the ringing became unbearable. I sat on the cold concrete floor, my back against a tunnel wall slick with moisture and soot. My hands were still shaking, though I no longer knew why. Fear had burned itself out hours ago, replaced by something emptier. Around me, people slept where they had collapsed, sitting upright, curled around children, leaning against pillars. Some were breathing, some were not. In the dim emergency lights, it was hard to tell the difference. A woman near the tracks opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling, unmoving. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stared, as if waiting for the sky to finish what it started. A child nearby whimpered in his sleep, calling for a father who had not answered all night. No one corrected him. No one had the strength. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting, my body older than it had been yesterday. The tunnel smelled different now, less like fear, more like aftermath. Dust hung in the air, fine and bitter, coating the tongue. Every breath tasted like metal and smoke. Somewhere down the platform, water dripped steadily, counting seconds no one wanted to measure. When the all-clear siren finally sounded, it didn't bring relief. It brought confusion. People looked at one another as if unsure whether they were allowed to move, to hope, to return to whatever waited above. Some stayed seated, afraid the sound was a trick. Others stood too fast and nearly fell, legs numb from hours of stillness. I walked toward the stairs that led back to the street. Each step felt like climbing out of a grave. The handrail was warm from countless hands gripping it through the night. At the top, daylight leaked in through cracks where walls used to be. London, or what remained of it, breathed weakly in the pale gray light. The street was unrecognizable. Buildings leaned at impossible angles. Windows were gone, replaced by jagged mouths. Smoke rose lazily from places that had burned themselves hollow. A tram lay on its side like a dead animal. Papers, letters, receipts, pages from books floated through the air, landing wherever the wind decided memory should rest. I stepped outside and felt the cold morning air on my face. It should have felt like survival. Instead, it felt like accusation. People emerged behind me, blinking, shielding their eyes. Some screamed when they recognized where they were. Some laughed a short, broken sound that ended too quickly. Others simply walked, calling out names that echoed down streets that no longer answered. I did my job because that was all I knew how to do. I picked up debris. I guided people away from unstable walls. I helped an old man sit down when his legs gave out. I cleaned blood from a stairwell without asking who it belonged to. Janitors don't ask questions. We erase evidence of chaos so the world can pretend it continues. But as the sun climbed higher, I realized something had changed. The city would rebuild. It always did. New bricks, new signs, new faces. But the night would never leave us. It had settled somewhere deep in the pauses between words, in the way people flinched at sudden noises, in how silence now felt dangerous. By midday, the sirens tested again. Everyone froze. Nothing happened. Still, no one relaxed. I returned to the tunnels before evening, broom in hand, because night would come again. And even if the bombs didn't, the fear would. Someone had to stay below, ready to clean, ready to guide, ready to witness. I was not a soldier. I was not a hero. I was just a man underground, holding the city together while it burned above. And when morning finally came, I understood the truth. Surviving the night was only the beginning.